Thank you all for joining. This is Power Up with AI, how to take your GRC to the next level. My name is Aaron Lumna. I'm here on the Trust Cloud team, and I will be the host for the session. So today we're going to do a deep dive into how artificial intelligence is changing the world of security, risk, and compliance, where in addition to lots of security threats and concerns, there's also a wealth of opportunity that we can take advantage of. So we will start off by looking at the current state of affairs when it comes to AI and GRC, including the risks involved, and then also we'll turn to some of the practical ways that teams are using AI to tackle challenges and make their lives easier. We will finish by exploring the future of AI, and then we'll leave some time at the end for some Q&A. So do feel free to submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom interface, and we will do our best to answer those. So I'd love to introduce you to our speakers for the day. So we're thrilled to have Walter Haydock, CEO of StackAware, and also Frank Chiazze, Privacy Director here at Trust Cloud. So it'd be great if you could both speak to your backgrounds a bit. And Walter, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate you having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk about the intersection of AI and GRC. So StackAware helps organizations manage the cybersecurity compliance and privacy risk from using artificial intelligence technologies. And before founding StackAware, I worked at a startup called Privacera, which was focused on data access governance. And then before that, I worked at a big B2B enterprise software company called PTC, running security for their IoT product line. And then prior to that, spent most of my career in government as a Marine Corps officer, and then also spent some time on Capitol Hill and in the intelligence.
Awesome. Thank you. And Frank, how about you?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Aaron. So a little about myself, Privacy Director here at Trust Cloud, but I actually started off my career in application security, working for a big bank, JP Morgan Chase, and I've bounced around since then. One of my more pivotal roles was working as an external auditor at Shaman, where I got to inspect and look at many different organizations' infrastructures. That's also where I really got deep into privacy, and there's definitely a lot of privacy concerns when it comes to AI. And yeah, here we are.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for lending your time here. So let's get started. So in terms of the current state of AI, Walter, could you kind of tell us where we are in terms of security and what's going on?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, AI is nothing new under the sun. It's been really brought into the popular attention and focus with the release of ChatGPT last year by OpenAI. And there are tons of organizations that have been using some form or another of artificial intelligence, which I use as a very broad blanket term, whether that's a linear regression algorithm to predict some sort of parameter, or maybe they're doing more advanced stuff using large language models. That's been going on for a while, but now with the ability to interface with something like ChatGPT, whether using the user interface or even more powerfully with the application programming interface, organizations of any size, including my company, which is quite small, can really leverage state of the art in AI. So it's really been a democratization of the technology. Now, with the democratization of anything, you need to watch out for people who are well-meaning but don't necessarily understand the risks of the power that they're wielding, and then also you need to look out for malicious actors. So in the former category, there have been some reports of what I would call unintended training of large language models using proprietary data. And then also there have been many examples of both security researchers who are ethical hackers and then unethical hackers using AI tools to accelerate their ability to cause mayhem. So a lot of potential good, but also a lot of potential risks when you're talking about AI and security.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. You touched on some of the security concerns right there, but I know you talk a lot about just some of the different privacy concerns that come up with some of the large language learning models that have come out in the last year or so. Could you speak to some of those more specifically?
Yeah, sure. So when I talk about privacy, I'll call that a narrower focus, or a narrower subset of the general concern of data confidentiality. So in a broad, there's a broad data confidentiality concern when using artificial intelligence technologies. There's the kind of traditional, just IT security, can a malicious actor access our data? Or have we configured our applications, our servers correctly? Our infrastructure's service provider, is that set up correctly? Those are all concerns that continue with AI development. As you probably recently heard, some researchers at Wiz identified a huge data trove from Microsoft's AI research team. So not an AI specific attack, but shows that the basics of information security do not go away even when you're conducting AI research. Then, if you layer on top of that, you've got kind of the biggest confidentiality concern in my mind would be that of unintended training, and that happens when someone provides information to a large language model that is actively training on it, and then in retrospect decides, oh, probably I shouldn't have allowed the model to train on this data. And an example would be the OpenAI ChatGPT product. When you're using the user interface, not the application programming interface, but the user interface will train by default unless you opt out of that functionality. And there was some reporting earlier this year that some Samsung employees had submitted some confidential source code as well as some meeting notes to ChatGPT with the user interface, and it's implied that they did not turn off the default training um, setting on that tool, thus suggesting that now ChatGPT is aware of, or has access to this confidential information. None of this has been confirmed. It's obviously Samsung is keeping it tight-lipped about it, but that is an example of the potential problem of unintended training. And then a related privacy issue that isn't it's separate from unintended trading is what I call sensitive data generation, where it's possible that a model that was never trained on any of your personal data could intuit that data from other information that it has and consistently reproduce that information, whether it's in a public facing way or in an internal way. And it's not 100% clear how organizations would fix that problem if someone, for example, submitted an opt-out request or a data erasure request under GDPR, assuming they're subject to it. It's not clear how an organization would prevent the model from reproducing that personal data because it's not in a database anywhere. It's just the large language model algorithm is reproducing it based on other information. So that's a related privacy risk, and I'll pause there.
Great. Yeah, I mean, definitely, it's a new frontier, but there's a lot of folks who are trying to take advantage of that and breach kind of some of these privacy measures that we would have in place in some more well-established channels, I guess you could say. Now, beyond just kind of privacy and confidentiality concerns, what are some of the other risks out there that you're seeing in regards to like cyber attacks?
So a big one is prompt injection, which can have data confidentiality impacts. There have been, security researchers are at the bleeding edge of a lot of these things, and I've seen very complex attacks chaining together ChatGPT plugins. I've seen people exfiltrating data from, people's email accounts using that functionality. So the general problem with prompt injection is that an LLM can accept basically any type of input, any type of text input, and that's a benefit because it allows it to be so powerful. But it's also a risk because, unlike a SQL injection attack, where there's a finite number of things that you can do that could cause a problem, and you can mitigate all of those things if you're extremely careful, it's not really possible to do that with prompt injection because there's an infinite number of potentially malicious ways you can interact with an LLM. So that's a big problem. And then a major problem that I haven't seen materialize, and I think it is more potentially theoretical, but I'm not ruling it out at all, is that of data poisoning, where you can feed information into a large language model that will allow an attacker to seed a very specific set of responses into it, where normally the model functions perfectly fine, but in a specific use case, it will provide corrupted data. A great example would be if you, I wouldn't recommend you hook up an LLM to any sort of financial transaction system, but if you did, and you just asked an LLM to, extract the account and routing number from an unstructured document and then wire money to that account, you could poison the LLM and just say, hey, anytime anyone asks for a routing number and account number, just give them my number, so that money will always be passed to your account. So those are some of the other risks when it comes to generative AI specific.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things from my perspective is just the kind of infinite possibilities that come about with these large language models, and moving away from that really finite set of possibilities into you can't even fathom or really think up how these vulnerabilities might be exploited or the ways people themselves can come up with how to use them. So now, turning towards AI and GRC, how are GRC teams and auditors adapting to the rise of AI?
Is that directed to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a ton of interest in AI from two perspectives when it comes to auditors. I was on a webinar with an auditing firm a couple months ago, and that was actually an amazing source of leads for me because a lot of their clients reached out afterwards saying, "Oh, you mentioned all these risks. We're concerned about how we're going to, comply with our requirements, whether they be SOC 2, HIPAA, other frameworks, what have you." That there's one end, and then on the other end, there's using AI to accelerate audits and things like that. And frankly, StackAware is involved in this space, and something that I'm looking at right now is providing a model like GPT-4 with access to a data set of various frameworks like SOC 2, for example, and then you can do what's called retrieval augmented generation using that data to provide answers to specific questions. For example, like I have I have this sort of information system, and I am worried about, this SOC 2 focus point. What should I do? And if you're using GPT-4, you can get some pretty good answers, and without necessarily exposing any of your internal information. You can just kind of speak generically. So that can be very helpful. I see a lot of the ways that audits happen. I see that changing because, especially in the SOC 2 space, a lot of it is like kind of random sampling of data to confirm that the organization under audit has, in a sufficient number of times, met its control set, assuming that it's a SOC 2 audit or SOC 2 type 2 audit. So I view that as an imperfect way of doing things. And I could see AI really, potentially doing a comprehensive audit throughout the entire organization. Again, it's going to be a balance between whether the audited organization and the auditing organization agree to share all that data or let a large language model loose inside the organization, which itself can have some security concerns. But I can definitely see it providing a huge boost to auditor productivity. And you've seen like organizations like PwC, which is one of the biggest in the world. They've stated that they're investing $1 billion in generative AI technology. So it's clearly caught their attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and when it comes to compliance specifically too, it's such a manual project that you have to go through, and there's all the controls and the audit, like you mentioned. There's such an opportunity there for AI to help out with those manual aspects and really help speed those up. And that's something that we'll go into in a bit. When it comes to GRC's planning ahead, and kind of factoring it into their plans and future projects? What are some things that they should keep in mind?
At a minimum, have a policy in place for how your employees should interact with AI tools. It can be a standalone policy, it can be part of an acceptable use policy. I provide a free template for a standalone policy, and that policy, what it should do is it should identify what the process is to get a new tool certified, what data you can put into which tools, and a list, an enumeration of the potential risks and ways that you should go about mitigating those risks. So if I've heard of organizations sending out emails saying like, don't put any confidential information into ChatGPT, for example, that's kind of a very narrow piece of guidance, which is good, but you should work that back into your data classification policy. You should work it into, like I said, the acceptable use policy, and tie it to all your existing policies so that you've got coverage over all the potential ways in which employees can interact with these new tools. And what I would strongly recommend not doing is a blanket ban on ChatGPT or similar tool, because then you're just going to have a lot of shadow IT that is shadow AI essentially, and that can be really ugly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, kind of keep everything in the light. You know, you're not doing yourself any favors by keeping everybody from using it. Awesome. Now I know you're working on an AI risk kind of framework and how to assess that. How are teams going about assessing risk now? How would you recommend that they think about this?
Yeah, one apropos, I don't think I can drop a link into the chat, but someone asked for a link to the policy. And if you just go to policy.stackaware.com, you will be able to get it. So pretty simple URL, policy.stackaware.com. So when it comes to assessing AI risks, there is, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology have released an AI risk management framework, the AI RMF, that does, it's a relatively comprehensive, but it's a high level approach for assessing risk related to artificial intelligence systems. And what StackAware is doing is taking that and all the other existing frameworks, whether it be the cybersecurity framework, the privacy framework, SOC 2, looking at high trust and ISO 27001, and taking all those requirements and with an AI specific focus, identifying what specific controls you should put in place when using AI, whether you're hosting model, an open source model in your own infrastructure as a service environment, or if you are using a third-party vendor. Some examples of things you should do are identify what the data retention policy is of a third-party vendor. For example, in the terms and conditions for OpenAI, if you use the API, there's a 30-day data retention period with some exceptions for legal holds and things like that. If you use the UI, the user interface, there is basically an indefinite retention period. It's vague. It says, as long as they need it for their business purposes. So understand what the data retention periods are, understand what the default training settings are. Are you default opted in? Are you opted out and you need to opt in? Should you opt in? I mean, if you're training on weather data, training API on weather data, like maybe that's sensitive, but probably not. But if you're working with proprietary information, you should probably be very concerned about having an externally hosted model training on that data and apply appropriate controls. Some of the things you should look at are if you are connecting any of your databases to an AI tool, minimize the amount of information to the absolute fields necessary that get sent to that tool. So, enterprising software engineers will sometimes be in a rush to hook up a system, and they'll just kind of return every field from a GET request. That's probably not a good idea generally, but it's especially bad with AI systems if you're just dumping huge amounts of information that don't need to be fed to the system into it. that could lead to some of those unintended trading situations. And then also some things to look at as well are you is the nature of the AI system, does this trigger any sort of requirements under any of the privacy frameworks? So for example, there is under GDPR, there's some special restrictions on processing of biometric data and using that for behavioral analysis. So I know some video recording tools will do like sentiment analysis on the call of the people who are speaking. So take a look at that and make sure you really narrow down and neck down on your requirements there.
Great. Yeah, those are some great recommendations. You brought up the NIST AI RMF, and Frank is actually going to touch on that. So Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Walter. So as Walter mentioned, there are a couple different frameworks for AI security out right now. I think probably one of the most talked about ones is the NIST AI RMF risk management framework. And like Walter mentioned, it is extremely comprehensive, but also really high level at the same time in terms of how does one establish controls in their program to, assess the risk of using AI in the organization. But we'll walk through it from, we'll touch on it just because I could spend a whole day workshop / webinar just diving deep into the NIST AI security framework. And more specifically, a lot of the statements they've made around human and AI interactions and what part that's going to play for GRC teams. So I think there were some really big points that I got out of reading the NIST AI RMF that I'd love to just cover with you all. The first one being how they're saying human roles and responsibilities to decision-making and overseeing AI systems need to be clearly defined and differentiated, right? Decisions made by humans, how does that incorporate into AI systems? Because more likely than not, a lot of these AI services are going to be used for decision-making, right? Whether you are evaluating recruits for an organization or you are making analytical decisions to present to leadership about what they should do next as a business, there's definitely going to be a use of AI systems as for decision-making, not just content creation, right? So being able to differentiate responsibility of such decision-making between humans who are hopefully going to be doing some human factoring training on the AI systems and the AI systems themselves. Because as Walter mentioned, a lot of these AI systems are designed to learn through use, right? They can learn through end users and essentially get better, right? But if they're not taking in the right information from end users, it could lead to biasy. The second point was decisions that go into design, development, deployment, evaluation, and use of AI systems collect systemic and human cognitive biases, right? There's always going to be the risk of bias here. If a certain group of end users are all pretty similar and have similar ideals and they're the ones using AI systems, AI is just going to learn from what that group of users is providing it from an input standpoint and feedback standpoint, and that could lead to some biasy risks. And then one of the other major points that I read was systemic biasy at the organizational level can influence how teams are structured and who controls the decision-making process throughout the AI lifecycle. These biases can also influence downstream decisions by end users, decision makers, and policymakers, and may lead to negative impacts. When you have such a powerful tool, you tend to rely on it heavily and lean on it. And I think human nature might essentially be a little bit lazy in a sense that we're trying to get by, right? When you're using AI systems that are going to be making major decisions very rapidly on the fly, there might not be time for humans to take a step back and assess and factor. And so those decisions might be taken, at 100%, this is the right decision. And that could essentially trickle down to not only end users, but decision makers and policymakers. And that influence is essentially a major risk in a sense that, who is making the decisions, who's influencing the decision-making of the AI systems? Is it the right people? Are those people providing enough input to the system to be able to allow it to not have biasy? And those are some of the major questions that I picked up from that section of the NIST AI RMF standard. One other major area I really found interesting was the one below on AI actors called out in the AI RMF who perform human factors tasks, and activities can assist technical teams by anchoring in design and development processes to user intentions and representatives of the broader AI community and societal values. These actors further help to incorporate context-specific norms and values in system design and evaluate end user experiences in conjunction with AI systems. We're almost entering a little bit of a philosophical and ethical realm here when it comes to talking about the role that users, AI actors, which are the people that are the designers, the developers, the purchasers of third-party AI services, and then obviously the end users, the really major role they're going to play into the AI lifecycle. And right now, there are a set of societal norms and values that have been established for centuries and millennia, right? What sort of impact are AI systems going to have on these societal values and norms when it comes to organizations, communities, nations relying on the processing that these AI systems are doing? So getting through all of the discussion statements of the NIST AI RMF is basically built around 4 pillars. You have govern, which is building a culture of risk management, and it's cultivated and present. You have map, which is context is recognized and risks related to context are identified. Measure, identified risks are assessed, analyzed, and tracked, and then managed risks are prioritized, acted upon based on a projected impact. Now, this sort of framework could apply to so many different areas, which goes back to Walter saying that it's a bit high level, right? There's not really enough AI specific meat there to this general framework, but maybe that's all we have at this time based on how new a lot of the new developments are and our understanding of them, not only as GRC professionals, but as human beings, right? If you want to go to the next slide. I think what it really boils down to for a lot of the frameworks that I've looked at so far is how does one define trustworthiness in an AI system? And going back to the map function, essentially being able to map, purposes, benefits, and risks to specific contexts, components of AI systems. Essentially, that's how you get started with defining what trustworthiness is. And in this diagram, there are a couple little blocks that explain, what would be a trustworthy component of an AI system. First, it should be safe, should be secure and resilient, should be explainable, interpretable, privacy enhanced, fair. Above all, it should be valid and reliable, and accountable and transparent. Right now, it's really hard to assess and measure these different, domains for, let's say you are using OpenAI. How can you prove that OpenAI is fair? How can you prove that it's privacy enhanced? How can you prove that it's explainable, interpretable? Like, it's really difficult to understand the underworkings of a lot of these third-party artificial intelligence systems. So that's going to be a major problem that a lot of AI security frameworks are going to have to solve, right? How do we essentially pinpoint each one of these tenets to various, not only just a model as a whole, but various components of the model in order to come up with a way to measure trustworthiness? And I think there's going to be a lot of debates leading up to that point, but we're hopefully going to have some more answers coming soon. So like I said, I looked at a couple different frameworks. An interesting one here is the Microsoft AI security framework, in a sense of defining roles. So this is the govern aspect of, you have your AI designers, you have AI admins and officers, you have your AI business consumers, and each of those roles have a part to play in terms of, what sort of responsibilities and requirements they have to the safety and trustworthiness of AI systems. For example, the AI designer, they're going to be designing and developing interpretable and enhanceable models, keywords, interpretable, right? For an AI admin and officer, these are your GRC folks, security officers. We're going to be making sure that there's some sort of security for the systems. We're going to be making sure that there's definitely some sort of monitoring, so we can add any sort of metrics from the monitoring to our measurability when it comes to the NIST AI RMF measurability. And then you have your business consumer, right? A feedback loop on the model for bias and fairness. The business consumer is probably going to be using and providing the most training to such a model. more likely than not. So just really making sure that any sort of responsibilities and requirements are clearly stated for the AI business consumer is going to be crucial. And inside of that too, you have, training, operationalize, and inferencing. And that's essentially the cycle that Microsoft has determined what it's going to look like when they develop and deploy AI systems for their businesses and their customers. This is a really interesting framework I found from a key Chinese think tank called DigiChina. Fortunately, it was translated so I could be able to read it off to you, but they've broken it down into 3 areas, right? You have your security applications, security risks, and security management, and they're all interdependent and independent of one another, right? From a security risk standpoint, starting off with national security, they've broken it down into military security and political system security. How can we make sure that there's no negative impact or influence on our military forces and our political systems from AI systems? You have societal security, which I found really interesting, going back to the privacy stuff said earlier. Employment security, how do we make sure that there isn't widespread unemployment due to the impact of newly implemented, super efficient and effective AI systems? Ethical security, how do we make sure that implementing certain AI systems are not a huge burden to ethics? It's the ethics of human society have been developed for centuries and millennia. And what if an AI system challenges the ethics of our societies to say that what it believes to be right is actually the right thing versus what is ethically right, according to us as a civilization? Then you have bodily security, right? And that's, physical harm caused from AI systems. I found this one very interesting, probably more detailed in terms of how do you look at governance, how do you look at the governance infrastructure of your AI systems, breaking it into these 3 different categories. And then obviously the security management is the enforcement of protection of, your people, your organization, your business, and your objectives. And security applications, those are, security tools that could be incorporated for AI systems. So with all that said, there's so many different frameworks, and it can be very overwhelming. The one point that came to mind while I was going through all of this is supply chain risk management. It just got a whole lot spicier, right? I imagine that 99% of organizations are going to be using third-party AI services. Not a lot of them are going to be developing AI models internally. They might be building off of other existing models, but there's going to be a lot of leverage and leaning on already existing models such as OpenAI's GPT 3.5, 4, GPT-5 coming out at some point, Hugging Face, right? There's this 1% of players that have spent a lot of time and effort building really effective and efficient models that are only going to keep getting better as other organizations tend to use them. So that being said, supply chain risk management, vendor management is going to have to evolve. It's going to have to change. If you don't already have a holistic and 100% view of all of your critical vendors, your business, third parties, if you don't have an ongoing SBOM, software bill of materials, you're a little bit behind, right? Because essentially you're going to have to adapt and adjust a lot of these processes to include the assessment of AI for a lot of these vendors and your software components in your organization. But that being said, AI can definitely be used to leveraged to improve GRC, right? You can use it essentially for intelligent predictions and recommendations, which at Trust Cloud, we have incorporated a new feature for business intelligence using AI and machine learning. You can have AI-generated project management of GRC initiatives. As GRC professionals, we all know there's 100 different tasks that we have to complete at any given time. How do you go about prioritizing to make the biggest impact on your organization? You can use AI for that. Answering security questionnaires faster, right? I think we all can agree that security questionnaires are not fun, whether it's 10 questions or it's a 300 question questionnaire for a health customer of some sort that has many different regulations and compliance obligations to put on you. Using AI to sift through all of your controls, your policies, your procedures to essentially pre-fill these responses for you is a time saver, right? And then eliminating manual knowledge base management, keeping a knowledge base up to date, making sure that versioning is correct, and then also being able to add on top of that. AI we've all seen is is pretty solid at creating content. It might not be always accurate for the most part, but it is very quick with being able to assess a large amount of data and come up with summaries and instructional guides. And then going back to, this is essentially a graph of a diagram for CrowdStrike Falcon, which is a endpoint detection and response tool that's been around for a while. And this is essentially how they see the use of AI for cybersecurity tools. I believe that the same process could be copied over for GRC as well too, where essentially you have some sort of sensor to monitor for governance, risk, or compliance violations. These events are organized through telemetry, and then there's essentially a model to assess and analyze that event based on your program, your information security program, your privacy program, the controls you have in place, and the people you have in place to basically be responsible for it. It can even go as far as doing preventions, right? Let's say somebody is about to violate an acceptable use policy, and you have a prevention in place to provide a warning to say you can't do this because you're going to violate this clause of the acceptable use policy. And essentially, this is a cyclical process, but the most important part is the expert input, the human input, right? AI is learning with us, not just from us. We are learning alongside our AI systems, and we have the knowledge we gain from its insights, and then we have the training in terms of that was a good observation or that was a bad observation, going right back into the system to improve it over time. So in my own personal life, I've been really interested in AI and machine learning, and I had a couple of really interesting personal projects that I conducted end of last year. One of them being essentially how can you use machine learning to take public information. For example, I'm taking CVE data, CVE vulnerability information from MITRE.org, and use machine learning algorithms and predictive models to essentially predict who are going to be the more vulnerable vendors and suppliers in the next 7 days, the next 30 days, based off of the incoming CVE information, to try to detect patterns, right? How can we make supply risk management a little bit easier by having some sort of predictive data, essentially based off of what's being released publicly? That was a really interesting project I worked on last year. And then another one, how can you also use public data? For this one, I created an application that can study Twitter for specific keywords such as vulnerability, breach, incident, security patch across a subset of the top 100 vendors to try to assign a risk value to each of those vendors based on how much public chatter around specific security vulnerability buzzwords are occurring on Twitter, right? And so these are just two examples of ways that we can start to think about areas like third-party risk assessment, third-party risk management, and supplier risk management. And I'm just one person who built these tools and applications. What can a whole company do in order to help accelerate and solve a lot of these problems?
Great. Well, yeah, I think that was a really good deep dive into some of the frameworks that we're seeing in terms of assessing risk around AI, and then also some of the opportunities. So just to round out our discussion, we're almost at time here, and just a reminder to folks listening in, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those to the Q&A panel. But just looking ahead, Walter, where do you see AI going in the short term? What are some things that we should be looking out for as it evolves?
Yeah, I'd say there's going to be the standard arms race that happens in the security world, but also in the broader world between attackers and defenders. So attackers are going to be basically unconstrained in what they can do. They will leverage AI tools to the maximum extent possible to cause damage, to, in most cases, just make money for themselves however they can. And then defenders are always going to be more risk averse because they've got something to protect, and they're going to move more slowly to onboard these systems. And perhaps the only thing that is going to be pushing these in the opposite direction is the business need to leverage AI tools to enhance productivity and deliver value to customers. So I think you're going to see this continuing dynamic of the business pushing AI deployment ahead security compliance teams somewhat resisting it, and then attackers just going wild with with the latest and greatest when it comes to AI. So my recommendation would be take a forward leaning approach to using AI for both business and security use cases, and know that either your competitors are going to be deploying AI or malicious attackers are going to be deploying AI. So don't try to plug your finger in the dike. It's going to be a wave, so you might as well ride it and try to security and compliance folks try to help the business teams deploy it as securely as possible, but don't stand in their way, because I think that will lead to irrelevance, frankly. So that's my take. And if you want to learn more about how StackAware tackles these problems, just go to stackaware.com. And we've got tons of AI risk management courses, pre-built products, things like that to help folks with these types of problems.
Great. Frank, anything to add in terms of how AI will evolve?
Yeah, yeah. I foresee, especially since we get closer to, generative AI, artificial generative intelligence, there's going to be major organizational restructure, right? If you have a system that can replace the jobs of 20 to 30 people just because you go and cut costs, right? I unfortunately foresee that happening for a lot of organizations. That being said, there's also the risk of not having that human element to check in and check for correctness and biasy on these AI systems. So there's going to be more of an emphasis on auditing them. Fortunately, or maybe not fortunately, a lot of the burden of auditing, the trustworthiness of AI systems is going to fall on that 1% of AI service providers, right, that everybody is using. When you think about AWS, a lot of organizations host in AWS and Google Cloud. They pass over or carve out a lot of their security controls to these organizations because they're the ones managing whatever is being assessed or audited in those certain controls. I think there's going to be similar to future AI regulations and certifications. Whereas if you're using a third-party AI system, you're going to have to make sure that they have the necessary certifications and audits in order to use them. So definitely going to be, like I said, supply chain risk is going to get spicier in terms of really inventorying all of your usage of AI, whether it's through third party or whether it's internally because you're developing or building on top of another system. There's going to be a lot of changes there, but it's going to be really interesting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, that concludes the formal part of our session. Like I said, if anybody has any questions, now is the time to submit those. We did have a couple come in throughout the presentation. So one of them is it better to wait until guidelines become clearer and these regulatory bodies come up with more guidance before incorporating them into your GRC policies, strategy, so on and so forth? Walter, that might be a good one for you to answer.
No, bottom line. So I was at a conference last week about generative AI, and there were some folks from the major policy arms of a big bank and a big law firm, and they both agreed that, at least in the United States, we're not going to see comprehensive AI legislation until 2025 at the earliest, post-presidential election. And then in Europe, the EU AI Act is kind of moving along through the legislative process, but I think the earliest that it would come into force would be 2025 as well. 2026 looking more likely. So there are existing rules and regulations and frameworks and things like that. Abide by those, absolutely. But trying to wait for clarity from regulators on the gray areas, you're probably going to be waiting a long time. And you're going to find out along the way through regulation by enforcement what is acceptable and what is not. And frankly, from a personal perspective, I think that's not a very good way to do business from the government side of things. But that's how the government does business. I mean, how are we going to find out what's a material cybersecurity incident according to the SEC? Well, I think we're going to see organizations that get SEC enforcement actions for not issuing the appropriate disclosures after a material cybersecurity incident, and then people are going to adjust. That's not optimal, and I don't think that's the right way to do business, but no one asked me from the SEC, so that's how they're going to do it. And I think it would behoove people to move to be forward leaning, to keep your eyes open. And as soon as these decisions and judgments come down, then that will help establish lanes in the road. But your competitors aren't going to wait, and malicious actors are not going to wait. So don't wait.
Yeah, and to add on that too as well, I'm starting to see through one of our tools called Trust Share, where our customers can essentially automate some of the painstaking process of answering customer security questions. An influx of security questions related to AI, the use of AI. Has the organization mapped out their usage, conducted a risk assessment? And so there's definitely organizations starting to take this seriously and move faster than the legislation makers can. And that drives business, right? If you don't answer the security question, or maybe you lose the deal. And if you don't answer the AI security questions, you lose the deal. So because of this, we're starting to look into creating an AI security framework at Trust Cloud, essentially to help our customers who have or are starting to see questions around AI, give them an opportunity to have controls in place for AI security and present those controls and any evidence of such to their own customers whenever these security questionnaires come in, because it's going to take years for the proper legislation to come out. But business is still moving, and people have those questionnaires that are coming out.
Yeah, all great points to keep in mind. Another question came through. What tools are out there right now to help combat against AI cyber attacks, if any?
Yeah, well, so there are a whole lot of tools, right? The machine learning cybersecurity tool space has been around for a bit. When you look at solutions like, CrowdStrike Falcon is probably my go-to in terms of an endpoint detection and response suite, where you have an agent that uses machine learning and AI algorithms to determine, is this event a real event or is it a false positive, and what is the risk and severity of this event in terms of prioritizing how you can address, respond, and remediate it. That's one of the major ones that comes to mind.
Awesome. All right, well, that's all the time we had for today. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who joined for listening in. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Frank, for speaking. We will send out a copy of the slides to everybody who attended, and also a recording of this session. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.